The stagecoach wheels had barely stopped grinding against the frozen mud of Coldwater Crossing before Irene Yates stepped down onto the Montana soil with nothing but a carpet bag, a worn leather satchel, and absolutely no idea what she was going to do next. The year was 1879, and the last light of a November afternoon was bleeding orange and violet across the jagged peaks of the Beartooth Range, painting the sky in colors so brutal and beautiful that Irene had to stop walking just to look at them. She stood there in the middle of the dirt road, her dark traveling dress dusted gray from 3 days on the coach, her brown hair coming loose from its pins in the sharp mountain wind, and she breathed in cold air that tasted like pine resin and ice, and something else entirely, something wild and clean, and wholly unfamiliar, to a woman who had spent every one of her 26 years in the crowded, soot-stained air of Cincinnati, Ohio. Behind her, the stagecoach driver, a wiry, tobacco-chewing man named Holt, tossed her trunk down from the roof with considerably less ceremony than the occasion seemed to deserve. "Last stop, ma'am," he said, already climbing back up to his seat. "Stage don't run again until Thursday." "Thursday," Irene repeated, and she looked around at what constituted the town of Coldwater Crossing, Montana Territory. There was a general store with a sagging porch, a saloon that sounded, even from the street, like it was hosting a full argument, a livery stable, a post office that shared its building with what appeared to be a dentist's office, based on the hand-painted sign above the door, and an inn, if the word inn could be stretched generously enough to cover a 2-story building that leaned slightly to the left, and whose sign read Millie's Rooms in letters that had clearly been repainted several times over faded older letters. The coach rolled away, and Irene picked up her trunk by its worn leather handle and dragged it toward Millie's rooms. The woman behind the desk inside, presumably Millie, though she never introduced herself, looked up from a ledger book with the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago. She had iron gray hair pulled back so tightly it looked like it hurt, and she was wearing a dress the color of old dishwater. "Room?" Irene asked. "Last one," Millie said. "$1 a night. Includes breakfast but not supper." "How long has the last room been the last room?" Millie looked at her with something approaching respect. 3 days. Before that it was 2 rooms. Before that 4. Irene opened her satchel and counted out $3. "I'll take it for 3 nights," she said, "while I figure out my situation." "What is your situation?" Millie asked, because in a town of 200 people, privacy was largely a theoretical concept. Irene considered lying. She was good at a great many things. She could type 40 words per minute on a Remington. She could keep ledgers with precise accuracy. She could speak French tolerably well, and she could bake a pie that had won 2 consecutive ribbon prizes at the Hamilton County Fair. She had used all of these skills in the employ of a Cincinnati shipping company called Yates and Beaumont, and the Yates in that partnership had been her late father, who had died in March and left her exactly nothing because the business had been deeper in debt than anyone had told her. And the Beaumont, one Gerald Beaumont, age 52, with wet eyes and a habit of standing too close, had been her father's business partner and had subsequently made it abundantly clear that he expected Irene to solve the problem of that debt by marrying him. She had not married Gerald Beaumont. She had instead packed everything she owned, taken the train to Chicago and then to Billings, and boarded the first stagecoach heading somewhere that was not anywhere Gerald Beaumont would ever think to look for her. She had chosen Coldwater Crossing, Montana Territory, because the name had appeared on a notice board at the Billings depot advertising that the town was seeking a schoolteacher. And Irene, while not precisely a schoolteacher by training, was educated enough to bluff her way through the role until something better presented itself. The trouble was, she had checked at the general store within 10 minutes of arriving, and the storekeeper, a round-faced man named Cutter, had informed her, with genuine regret, that the school position had been filled the previous week by a Miss Priscilla Ames, who had come all the way from Vermont and seemed very settled. So now she had $3 left after paying for the room, a trunk full of clothes and books and 2 very good kitchen knives, and no prospects whatsoever in a mountain town that was about to enter its worst winter in a decade. "My situation," she told Millie, "is complicated." Millie nodded as if this was the most sensible answer she had heard in months and handed her a key. Irene went upstairs, set her trunk at the foot of the bed and sat on the mattress, which creaked loudly enough to wake the dead, and did not cry. She was not particularly a woman given to crying. She had cried precisely once in the past year, at her father's graveside, and she had decided that was her allotment for the foreseeable future. Instead, she pulled her journal from her satchel and wrote in it for 20 minutes, cataloging her assets and her options, and when she had finished, the list of options was considerably shorter than she would have liked. She could write to her cousin Margaret in St. Louis and ask for money, but Margaret's husband disliked Irene intensely and would make her pay for the favor in ways that were difficult to quantify. She could ask Millie if there was any work at the inn. She could inquire at the saloon, though she had a clear sense of what kind of work was available there, and it was not work she intended to do. Or she could go see the man that Cutter at the general store had mentioned when she had asked if anyone in town needed help of any kind. Arthur Lockhart might, Cutter had said, with an expression that was 1/4 respect and 3/4 something else she couldn't read. "He comes in for supplies every couple weeks. Lives up on the eastern slope of Harrow Peak, about 8 miles out. Traps, hunts, does some guiding work in the summer when rich men from the east come out to shoot things. Keeps mostly to himself. He might need someone to help keep records, seeing as he's got a line of traplands and hunting contracts that are getting complicated for one man to manage." Is he a reasonable man? Irene had asked. Cutter had considered this. "He's the most reasonable man I've ever known who could also break a pine log in half with his bare hands," he had said, and somehow that had been both the most alarming and the most reassuring thing she'd heard all week. She fell asleep that night thinking about it, and in the morning she made a decision. She would walk out to Harrow Peak and talk to Arthur Lockhart. It was either that or write to Margaret, and she would climb the mountain with her bare hands before she wrote to Margaret. She did not have to climb with her bare hands. She borrowed a horse from the livery, a sensible gray mare named Duchess who seemed to hold a similar opinion of humans to Millie's, and she rode east through the first light of a clear Montana morning, and the mountains around her were so staggering in their enormity that she forgot, briefly, to be afraid. The road east toward Harrow Peak was not really a road. It was a track, and then a path, and then more or less just the general direction of upward. The pine trees grew denser and taller, and the air grew sharper, and the frost on the fallen leaves crackled under Duchess's hooves like broken glass. Irene pulled her wool coat tighter around her and kept her eyes on the slope ahead. She smelled the cabin before she saw it. Wood smoke first, and then something warmer underneath it, coffee, she realized. Real coffee, not the chicory swill they had served at the stage relay stations. The smell of it was so unexpectedly welcoming in the frozen mountain air that her stomach clenched with something that was almost longing. The cabin came into view through a gap in the pines, a solid, substantial structure built from the very pines that surrounded it, low and wide with a stone chimney stack sending a steady column of gray smoke into the clear sky. There was a covered porch along the front, and a woodpile stacked against the near wall that was 8 feet tall and organized with the precision of someone who took their woodpile seriously. There was a small barn off to the right and a fenced paddock and a smokehouse and several outbuildings whose purposes she could not immediately determine. It was not what she had expected. She had expected something rougher, more frontier, a rough man's rough shelter. This was solid. This was built to last. The door opened before she had finished tying Duchess to the porch rail. Arthur Lockhart was not what she had expected either, though she realized immediately that she had not truly known what she was expecting. He was tall several inches over 6 feet, and broad through the shoulders in a way that the word broad did not entirely do justice to. He had the kind of build that came not from any particular effort toward it, but simply from a life of hauling and building and carrying, muscle that was functional rather than ornamental. His hair was dark brown and somewhat longer than was fashionable, curling slightly at the collar of his flannel shirt, and he had a short beard, not unkempt, but not trimmed to any particular precision either, and eyes that were the gray-green color of the mountains themselves in the early morning before the sun fully committed. He was 31 years old, though she did not know that yet. He looked like something that had grown out of the mountain itself, like the pines and the rock and the cold, clear streams. He was carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He held one out to her. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the cup, and then at him, and then at the cup again. "How did you know I was coming?" she asked. "Saw you coming up the track about 15 minutes ago," he said. His voice was low and even, with a quality of steadiness to it that she found immediately and unexpectedly calming. "You ride like someone who's not used to mountain paths. Took you longer than the distance warranted. I had time." She climbed the porch steps and took the cup from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. She wrapped both hands around the warm tin and breathed in the steam, and it was the best cup of coffee she had never yet tasted. "You always make coffee for strangers?" she asked. "You didn't look like a threat," he said. "You looked cold." She was, in fact, extremely cold, and the acknowledgement of it made her colder all at once, the way that being told to relax immediately makes a person tense. She drank the coffee, which was strong and black, and exactly what she would have asked for, and Arthur Lockhart leaned against the porch post with his own cup and watched her with the patient, assessing calm of a man who spent most of his life reading terrain and weather and animal sign, and had simply extended that skill to people. "I'm Irene Yates," she said. "I came in on yesterday's stage." "Arthur Lockhart," he said. "Cutter send you. He mentioned you might need help with records, business records, correspondence, accounting." Arthur was quiet for a moment, looking out over the valley below them, the narrow blue thread of the river, the cluster of brown and gray buildings that constituted Coldwater Crossing, the vast white shoulders of the peaks beyond. "He's not wrong," he said finally. "I've got contracts I can barely keep track of, a season's worth of fur inventory I haven't properly cataloged, and 3 letters from a hunting outfit in Philadelphia that I haven't answered because I'm not sure what to say." "I can help with all of that," Irene said. She said it with considerably more confidence than she felt, because confidence was the one currency she had left in any quantity. He looked at her then, a direct, unhurried look that was not unkind but was entirely without pretense. "What are you doing in Coldwater Crossing, Miss Yates? No offense to the place, but it's not where a woman in a dress that cost what yours cost generally ends up." She had not expected the observation to be so accurate, and the accuracy of it startled her into honesty. "Running away," she said, and then immediately regretted the vulnerability of it. But Arthur Lockhart did not react the way she expected. He did not press for details. He did not look at her with pity or with the particular kind of interest that some men showed when they learned a woman was alone and in trouble. He simply nodded once, as if running away was a perfectly legitimate reason to be standing on a mountain porch in Montana in November. "Running from something specific, or just generally?" "Something specific that I have no intention of going back to," she said. "Fair enough," he said. He drank the rest of his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. "I can offer you work. Come in a few days a week, help me sort out the paperwork and correspondence. I pay fair wages." "It's honest work, Miss Yates, nothing else involved." The last part was said without particular emphasis, but she understood it precisely. He was telling her clearly and straightforwardly what the arrangement would be and what it would not be. She was grateful for the directness in a way she could not entirely articulate. "When do I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you want," he said. "Come around mid-morning. I'll have the contracts laid out." She handed him back the empty tin cup, thanked him for the coffee, untied Duchess from the rail, and rode back down the mountain with the strange sensation that something in her life had just shifted, quietly and without announcement, in a direction she had not anticipated. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Within a week, she had established a system for Arthur Lockhart's papers that transformed what had been a disordered pile of contracts, receipts, correspondence, and hand-drawn maps into something that a reasonably organized person could navigate without a guide. She set up a ledger for his fur inventory, drafted polite but firm letters to the Philadelphia Hunting Company confirming 2 guiding contracts for the following spring, and organized his correspondence by sender and date in a wooden box she found in one of the outbuildings, which she cleaned and repurposed with his permission. Arthur worked around her. He was a man of routine and purpose. He was outside before dawn, checking trap lines or cutting wood or seeing to the animals, and he came in for a midday meal that he cooked himself with quiet competence. And in the afternoons he would sometimes sit at the table across from her and read through whatever she had sorted, asking questions that were precise and intelligent. He was not a man who wasted words, but when he did speak, the words were worth hearing. He had opinions about things, about the quality of the fur trade, about the treatment of the Crow people whose land this had been and still was in all the ways that mattered, about the winter weather, and the way the mountains read it before any almanac could. And his opinions were not bluster or performance, but the considered product of years of careful observation. She found herself listening to him more than she had intended to. He, in turn, listened to her in a way that she had not experienced with many people. When she told him about her father's company and the debt and Gerald Beaumont, she had not intended to tell him all of it, but it came out over several conversations across his kitchen table, unspooling naturally in the way things do when someone listens without judgment. Arthur did not offer solutions or opinions on what she should have done differently. He listened and he asked questions, and when she finished, he said, "You made the right call, leaving," with the quiet certainty of someone who had processed more than she'd said and arrived at a conclusion that was solid. "You don't know that," she said. "You only know my side." "I know enough," he said. A man who uses a woman's grief and financial desperation to push her into something she doesn't want is not a man who deserves her. The directness of it, the simple moral clarity of it, struck her somewhere between her ribs in a way she was not prepared for. The weeks moved by, and November deepened into December, and the first real snowfall came to Harrow Peak with the sudden, total commitment of a Montana mountain winter. Not the tentative inches that the town below got, but 3 feet in 2 days, silent and thorough and completely indifferent to inconvenience. Irene had been at the cabin when it started, working on a particularly detailed inventory of the spring's projected trap yields, and by the time she realized she should probably start back down the mountain, the track was already buried past Duchess's knees. Arthur came in from the barn with snow on his shoulders and ice in his beard and looked at the window and then at her. "You're not going anywhere tonight," he said. "I have to get back to Millie's," she said, though she recognized even as she said it that the statement was more reflexive than logical. "Duchess can't make it down that track right now," he said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door and going directly to the stove. "You can have the loft. There's a good bed up there and plenty of blankets. I've got supper going." She looked at the window, which showed nothing but white pressing against the glass, and then she looked at Arthur Lockhart, who was already ladling soup from the pot hanging over the fire with the uncomplicated practicality of a man who had dealt with many complications and found that practicality resolved most of them, and she said, "What are you making?" "Elk stew," he said. "I made enough for 2 days, but now I'll make it stretch to 3. "I can help," she said, and got up and went to the kitchen, and they stood side by side at that stove for the better part of an hour, and the soup was excellent, and the snow continued to fall outside, and neither of them spoke very much, but neither of them felt the silence as an absence. After supper, he showed her up to the loft, which was warm from the chimney running through it and contained a rope bed with a thick elk hide mattress and more wool blankets than she could count. He had lit a small lamp and left it on the shelf, and when he went back downstairs, he did not say good night in any particularly meaningful way, just a simple good night, and that simplicity was in itself a kind of safety that she had not realized she had been craving. She lay in the loft and listened to the wind working at the eaves of the cabin and the faint sounds of Arthur banking the fire below, and she thought that she had never, not once, felt safer in her life, and the strangeness of that realization, in a strange place, in a stranger's house, in the middle of a blizzard on the side of a Montana mountain, kept her awake a good while before she finally slept. She was still there in the morning, because 3 feet had become 4.5, and there was another full foot coming down as she looked out the loft window at the gray sky pressed close to the pines. Arthur had already been up for hours. She could tell. The fire was roaring, coffee was made, and he came in from outside stamping snow off his boots with the invigorating air of a man who found severe weather not merely tolerable but genuinely engaging. "How are you not frozen?" she asked from the top of the loft ladder. He looked up at her with something in his eyes that was close to amusement. "You get used to it," he said. "Coffee's ready." "Of course it is," she said, and climbed down. They were snowed in for 3 days. In the way of all close quarters and enforced proximity, those 3 days established a kind of intimacy that months of daily work visits had not quite managed. They played chess. Arthur had a wooden set he had carved himself over several winters, each piece distinctive and a little idiosyncratic, and Irene beat him the first game and he beat her convincingly in the next 3, and the competition brought out a pleasant sharpness in both of them. They read from his small but carefully chosen collection of books. He had Marcus Aurelius and Shakespeare, and a battered collection of naturalist essays, and a geological survey of the Montana Territory that he could navigate by memory. She had brought her own book in her satchel, a volume of George Eliot, and she read passages from it aloud after supper on the second evening, and he listened with his elbows on the table and his coffee cup cradled in his big hands, and when she finished a passage that struck her as particularly good she would look up and find him already looking at her, and she would feel the warmth of it in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. On the second evening he told her about himself, and she understood that this was not something he did with ease or frequency. He had grown up in Kentucky, one of 4 brothers, and had come west at 20 with a man named Jonas Freeth who had taught him trapping and guiding, and had died of a fever 8 years past, leaving Arthur the cabin and everything in it. He had considered going back to Kentucky but had found, when he thought carefully about it, that he did not particularly want to. The mountains had become his in a way that he could not explain precisely, but felt very clearly, the way a person feels about a place that has shaped them more fundamentally than any place of origin. "Do you get lonely?" she asked, and she asked it without softening because she had been around him long enough to know that he did not require softening. He was quiet for a moment, and the fire popped and sent a cascade of sparks up the chimney. "Sometimes," he said, "less than I expected to. Less than you expected, or less than you think you should." He looked at her across the table, and his gray-green eyes were very direct and very warm. "You ask good questions, Irene." She noticed that he had stopped using Miss Yates at some point during those 3 days and had not announced the change. It had simply happened, the natural way a formality dissolves when it becomes unnecessary. "My father used to say that," she said, and the mention of her father tightened something in her chest. "Tell me about him," Arthur said, and she did. She talked about her father for the better part of an hour. James Yates, who had been funny and impractical and enormously kind, who had let her work in his office from the time she was 14, because she was better at numbers than anyone he'd hired, who had told her she could do anything she set her mind to and had genuinely believed it, who had also been financially naive in ways that had ultimately undone everything he had built. She talked until the emotion was worn smooth enough to bear, and Arthur listened the whole time without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "He sounds like a man who deserved a better business partner." "He did," she said. "He deserved a great deal of things he didn't get." "So did you," Arthur said, and the quiet conviction of it hit her so squarely that she had to look away at the fire for a moment to collect herself. On the third day the snow stopped, and the sky cleared to the particular blazing blue of a mountain winter, and Irene packed her bag and went down the mountain on Duchess with the trail broken by Arthur on his big black horse ahead of her. She felt, riding down through the ice-laden pines in that crystalline morning air, the peculiar and not entirely comfortable sensation of not wanting to leave. She had been in Coldwater Crossing for 3 weeks. She had meant to be there long enough to make a plan and move on, and instead she had grown roots she hadn't noticed putting down. She told herself it was practical. The work with Arthur was real and paying. She had helped Millie with some bookkeeping in exchange for a reduced room rate, and the combination of the two was enough to live on reasonably, if carefully. She told herself she was staying for practical reasons, and she mostly believed it, and if there was some other, warmer, less easily categorized reason pressing underneath the practical one, she was not yet ready to examine it directly. Christmas came to Coldwater Crossing the way it came to all frontier towns, quietly, without the fanfare of cities, but with a warmth underneath it that was all the more genuine for its modesty. The saloon hung a wreath. Cutter's store put up a spruce bough in the window. Millie made a particular effort with breakfast on Christmas morning that involved actual fresh eggs and something approaching a cake. Irene had bought Arthur a small gift with considerable deliberation, a new leather journal with fine paper, because she had noticed that he kept his notes and observations in a worn ledger that was nearly full, and she had wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a piece of blue ribbon she had from her satchel. She had not expected him to get her anything. She had not expected him to appear at Millie's door on Christmas morning with a wooden box, very precisely made, fitted with dividers to hold correspondence, a desk organizer, built to her specifications, built with knowledge of her working habits that could only have come from months of watching her work. He had carved her initials into the lid, IY, in letters that were plain and strong. She looked at the box and then at him standing in the doorway of Millie's, snow on his coat shoulders, and she said, "You made this." "I had time in the evenings," he said, as if it were a casual thing, as if carving a woman's initials into something he had built for her with his own hands was simply how a person passed the winter evenings, and she thought that she had never in her life received a gift that had cost someone more of themselves and less of their money. "Arthur," she said, and the way his name came out of her was different from the way she had been saying it. There was something in the inflection, some softness, some intention that she had not put there deliberately, but that was there regardless. He heard it. She could tell because of the way he went very still for just a moment, and the way he looked at her, not with the patient, assessing calm she was used to, but with something more deliberate, more careful, as if he were reading something important and did not want to misread it. "Merry Christmas, Irene," he said. "Merry Christmas, Arthur," she said. They went to a small community supper that evening at the church, the only time Irene had seen much of Coldwater Crossing gathered in one place, and Arthur sat beside her at the long table, and the community watched them with the benign, speculative interest of a small town that has noticed a thing before the two people involved have entirely admitted it to themselves. Millie, serving biscuits, caught Irene's eye from across the table with an expression that communicated volumes without any words whatsoever. January arrived, and with it the true bite of a Montana winter, the kind that was not merely cold but actively hostile, the kind that could kill a man in the open within hours if he was unprepared. Arthur was always prepared. He had the practiced readiness of a man who had learned to respect the mountain on the mountain's own terms, and he managed the season with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He was more careful about Irene during that time, not hovering or condescending, but attentive in ways she noticed and did not ask him about. He always had the fire high when she arrived. He always sent her back to town earlier than strictly necessary on days when the weather was turning, with clear instructions about the trail and the sky. He appeared twice at Millie's during January with no stated reason, except to see that she was all right, and she found that she did not mind this at all, which told her considerably more about her own heart than she had been previously willing to admit. The admission itself came in February, on a Tuesday, and it came the way most real admissions do, not through a grand revelation, but through an ordinary moment that broke open unexpectedly. She had ridden up the mountain in bright morning sunshine, the kind of blinding white winter sunshine that made the whole landscape look like it had been etched in silver, and she had arrived at the cabin to find Arthur in the paddock dealing with a problem. One of his horses, the large bay he used for packing, had developed a bad cut on its foreleg and was in pain and not cooperating with examination. Arthur was trying to calm the animal and simultaneously clean the wound, which was a two-person job being attempted by one, and Irene tied Duchess to the rail, climbed the fence, walked to the horse's head and took hold of his halter. "Talk to him," Arthur said from the horse's flank. "He doesn't like the sudden movements." Irene did not know very much about horses, but she knew about managing anxiety, so she leaned close to the bay's face and spoke to him steadily and quietly about completely ordinary things, about the ledger she was working on, about the book she had been reading the previous night, about the way the sunrise had looked that morning over the eastern peaks and the horses breathing slowed, and he stopped fighting, and Arthur was able to clean and wrap the leg with the deft, careful hands of a man who had done this many times before. When it was done, Arthur looked up from his work at the horse's leg and found Irene still holding the halter, still talking quietly, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something more open than his usual careful steadiness, something that was very close to wonder, and she felt it land on her like the first warmth of a spring sun. They stood on opposite sides of the horse for a moment with nothing between them but the large, warm, injured animal and the bright winter air. "Thank you," he said. "I couldn't have managed that alone." "You were managing fine," she said, which was not precisely true. "I was managing less well before you climbed over that fence," he said, which was precise and direct, and said with enough quiet emphasis that it meant more than the literal statement. She looked at him over the bay's neck, and something was different between them from that moment. Neither of them named it yet. But it was there, unambiguously and unmistakably, in the way they moved around each other for the rest of that day, a new awareness, careful and warm, like something that needed to be protected until it was strong enough to stand on its own. It was another 2 weeks before anything was said directly, and it was Arthur who said it, because Irene was still managing the last of her instinct to protect herself, and Arthur, who was patient in all things, gave her the time. They were sitting at the table after supper. She had started staying for supper on her work days, which had happened so gradually and naturally that neither of them had formally established it. And she was reading, and he was working on something at the other end of the table, a detailed map of his trap line routes for the spring, and the fire was low and comfortable, and the cabin was very quiet in the way it got in deep winter. When the snow muffled the whole world and there was nothing outside but the cold and the stars, he set down his pen and she looked up. "Irene," he said. She had learned to hear everything in the way he said her name. "Yes," she said, not a question, an answer. His jaw worked slightly, and she realized with a kind of surprised warmth that he was nervous. This man who moved through blizzards and dealt with injured horses and managed everything the mountain threw at him with absolute calm was nervous, and the vulnerability of it opened something in her completely. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and if I'm wrong about it, tell me plainly and I'll respect that and nothing needs to change between us." "Go ahead," she said. "I think about you," he said. "Not in the way I think about work or the season or things that need doing. In a different way. I think about you when you're not here and I think about you when you are here, and I've been thinking about you since the morning you rode up my mountain with Cutter's name on your lips and took a cup of coffee from a stranger without flinching." He paused. "I don't know what your plans are, and I know you came here running from something and that landing somewhere might not be what you intended, but I needed to say that because I think it would be dishonest not to." The fire popped softly in the silence. "Arthur," she said, and her voice was very steady because she meant every word of what she was about to say. "I came here with no plan, and I ended up with something I didn't expect." "I didn't expect you." She folded her book closed. "I think about you too. I have been thinking about you since you handed me coffee on your porch before I'd even introduced myself, and I told myself it was just gratitude and then familiarity, and then I ran out of reasonable explanations." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she saw something in them settle, a tension releasing, something long-held and quietly patient finally arriving where it had been heading. "Can I come sit next to you?" he asked, because he was that kind of man, the kind who asked. "Yes," she said, and he came around the table and sat beside her, and the warmth of him in the close air of the winter cabin was very clear and very real. And when he reached out and took her hand carefully, the way he did everything, she turned her hand over and held his back. They sat like that for a long time, and the fire burned low, and outside the snow creaked under its own weight in the pines, and it was entirely sufficient. It was, in fact, more than sufficient. It was the most settled Irene Yates had felt in longer than she could clearly remember, and she understood, with the quiet certainty of something that is simply and finally true, that she was not planning to leave Coldwater Crossing. Spring came slowly to the mountain, the snow retreating in stages, revealing the ground beneath in patches that grew and merged until the brown earth was back, and then the first impossible green of new growth came pushing through. Irene had moved out of Millie's rooms by March. Millie had raised the rate, citing inflation in a way that Irene felt was approximately 20% inflation, and 80% a pointed encouragement in a particular direction, and had taken a small room in a house belonging to a widow named Clara Hatch, who had 2 extra rooms and a large vegetable garden, and a very direct personality that Irene found entirely refreshing. Arthur came to town twice a week now, which was more than his supply runs strictly required, and no one in Coldwater Crossing was surprised by this, least of all Millie and Clara Hatch, who appeared to communicate about it across the garden fence with remarkable frequency for 2 women who claimed to mind their own business. In April, when the trail to Harrow Peak was dry enough to ride comfortably, and the first of Arthur's spring contracts were pulling him into preparations, he met her one afternoon at Cutter's store, and they walked together down the length of the main street, which in Coldwater Crossing was not a long walk, and he told her he had 2 guiding parties coming in May, rich men from Philadelphia, the same hunting company she had corresponded with, and would be out in the backcountry for stretches of 2 weeks at a time. And he said this with the particular deliberateness of a man who is aware that the information changes some things. "I don't love the idea of you being out there for 2 weeks," she said honestly. "I've been doing it for years," he said equally honestly. "That was before I was invested in the outcome," she said, and the directness of it stopped him in the middle of the street and made him turn to look at her with a warmth that was very clear in the spring afternoon. "I'll be fine," he said. "I'm careful and I'll be back." "I know," she said. "I'm not afraid of you not being careful. I'm afraid of missing you." He reached out and touched her face, just his hand along her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, warm and steady, and he said, "I'll be back in 2 weeks, and I'll think about you every day I'm out there." "2 weeks then," she said, and she meant it as acceptance and as a kind of promise. He kissed her then, standing in the middle of Coldwater Crossing's main street on a clear April afternoon, with the mountains towering around them and the spring air smelling of thaw and pine and new earth, and it was unhurried and certain and very warm. And when it ended, she kept her eyes closed for a moment before she opened them, and he was looking at her with an expression that was at once joyful and serious and entirely without pretense. "Well," said a voice from the direction of Cutter's porch, and they turned to find Cutter himself sitting in his chair with an expression of profound satisfaction. "It's about time." Arthur looked at Irene with one eyebrow raised. She laughed a real laugh, warm and open, and he smiled, which was something she had been accumulating evidence of for months and found more rewarding each time. His smile transformed him from merely striking into something that made looking away feel like a small loss. The guiding season came and went. Arthur's parties were, as Cutter had reported to anyone who would listen, wealthy men from the East who wore entirely too many clothes for the conditions and shot at things with more enthusiasm than accuracy. And Arthur managed them with the stoic patience of a man who understood that his business required tolerance for human beings in all their varying degrees of competence. He came back from each expedition with money, stories he told with dry economy over supper, and the particular aliveness of a man who has been out in wild country and come back from it carrying its energy. Irene had used his time out in the field to do something she had been thinking about since the snow. She had gone to see Judge Alden, who functioned as Coldwater Crossing's closest thing to a legal authority, and had inquired about Gerald Beaumont's ability to make any legal claims on her. The judge, a thin, precise man who smelled of pipe tobacco, had reviewed what she told him and confirmed that no, Gerald Beaumont had no legal claim on Irene Yates. Her father's debts were not her debts. She had not signed anything, and she had not married anyone. She was entirely free. She had ridden back up the mountain with that confirmation sitting in her chest like a cleared weight, and she had sat on Arthur's porch in the afternoon sunshine and felt the freedom of it properly for the first time. Coldwater Crossing was not where she had planned to end up. It was where she had ended up anyway, and the difference between a plan and an arrival was that an arrival could surprise you. And what had arrived along with her, or perhaps had been here waiting on this porch when she rode up the mountain, was something she had not planned for and would not have traded for anything she had lost. Arthur came back from the last guiding trip of the season in late June, and Irene was at the cabin when he arrived, working at the table on the season's final accounts, and he came through the door with pine needles in his hair and trail dust on his boots and stopped when he saw her there and said nothing at all for a moment, just looked at her with everything he felt very clear on his face. "Good trip?" she asked. "It is now," he said, and crossed the cabin and kissed her properly, the way a man kisses a woman he has been thinking about for 2 weeks in the high country, and the ledger book could wait. It was July when he asked her. They were on the peak above the cabin, a climb he had taken her on several times now, a place where the pines thinned out and the rock was bare, and the view ran in every direction to the edge of sight, mountains stacked behind mountains, valleys folding into valleys, the sky so wide and blue above the peaks that it felt like being inside something vast and clean and permanent. She had seen him nervous twice now, the first time at the table in February, and now. She recognized the particular quality of his silence, the way he was measuring something. "Ask me," she said, because she could read him well enough by now to know what was coming, and because she had no intention of making him find it alone. He turned to look at her. "I was going to do this more carefully," he said. "You can be as careful as you like," she said. "I'll say yes regardless." Something broke open in his face at that, the tension going out of it, replaced by a joy that was so unguarded she felt it in her own chest. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a ring, simple, silver, with a small stone the color of the mountains in morning light, an aquamarine that he had gotten from a prospector's shop in Billings the previous month, though she did not know that story yet. "Irene Yates," he said, "will you stay on this mountain with me?" "I arrived on this mountain with no plan," she said, "and you gave me coffee before I asked for it. I think you've been asking me since that first morning." "Yes or no?" he said, smiling now fully the smile she had been collecting. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He put the ring on her finger, and then he held her hands in both of his, and they stood on the bare peak above the world with the wind moving through both of them and the whole of Montana Territory spread below. And it was one of those moments that does not require embellishment, because it is exactly what it is, a man and a woman on a mountain, in love, with everything ahead of them. They were married in September before the first snow. The wedding was at the church in Coldwater Crossing, because Clara Hatch had put her foot down about it being anywhere that did not have four walls, and because Millie had apparently been planning the reception in some capacity since approximately Christmas, and both women's investment in the event was not to be argued with. Judge Alden performed the ceremony. Cutter sat in the front row and wiped his eye with the kind of dignity a man maintains when he is absolutely certain he is not crying. Arthur had put on his best shirt and had trimmed his beard, and his dark hair was clean and combed, and he still looked exactly like what he was, a mountain man, solid and large and certain. And Irene walked up the aisle in a cream-colored dress that she and Clara had made from fabric ordered from Billings, and she did not look like someone arriving. She looked like someone arriving home. The vows were the old standard ones, but Arthur said his with the particular quality of meaning them one word at a time. And when he said the word, always he held her eyes, and she understood that he meant it in the way that people who live close to wild things understand always. Not as a promise made in ignorance of what could happen, but as a commitment made with full knowledge of everything that could happen and a choice to hold it anyway. They went back up the mountain that evening, the two of them, with Duchess and the black horse, and a cart loaded with things Irene had accumulated over the year she'd lived in Coldwater Crossing. The cabin had been made ready. Arthur had spent 3 weeks of June and July adding a proper bedroom to the east side, with a real wood floor and a window that looked toward the peaks, and he had made the bed frame himself from timber cut on the property. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom that first evening and looked at the window and the mountains beyond it in the last light, and Arthur came to stand behind her with his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him because she could, because he was large enough and solid enough and present enough to lean against, and because she had earned this and so had he. "I'm home," she said. "You have been for a while," he said. They had a year of that particular happiness that is partly made of everyday things: coffee in the morning, work side by side, supper together, evenings by the fire, and partly made of the larger thing underneath the everyday, the thing that gives ordinary moments their specific gravity. Arthur continued his trapping and guiding work. Irene took on the management of his business affairs completely, and in the second spring she had expanded his client list and renegotiated 2 contracts in terms that were substantially more favorable. And Arthur had looked at the numbers she showed him and said, "You should have gone into business yourself." And she had said, "I am in business. Our business." And the way he smiled at that was the kind of smile that she had learned to look for like a landmark. She also took on bookkeeping work for 3 other enterprises in Coldwater Crossing: the general store, the livery, and of all things, the saloon, whose owner, a broad-faced Scotsman named Hamish, had finally admitted that he could not balance his own books to save his life and was willing to pay someone to do it. Irene rode down to town 3 times a week now, not to work for Arthur but to work for herself, and she paid her portion into their household account with a satisfaction that was not merely financial. She had been corresponding, carefully, with a lawyer in Cincinnati about her father's estate. The lawyer recommended by Judge Alden had discovered that Gerald Beaumont had, in fact, made certain representations about the business's finances that were not entirely truthful, and there was the possibility of a recovery of some assets. She had pursued this with the quiet persistence of a woman who has been careful and patient long enough to trust the process. And in the spring of their second year together, a letter arrived containing a bank draft for an amount that was not a fortune but was substantial enough to matter: her father's legacy, rescued from the ruin of his bad partnership. She had held the draft in her hands and thought about her father, who had believed she could do anything, and had cried, not with grief this time, but with something that was partly grief and partly vindication. And Arthur had sat beside her with his arm around her and let her feel both things fully. She put most of the money into expanding the cabin, a proper second bedroom for when company came, and a real kitchen that did not require her to stand sideways to work. And she used a portion to order several cases of books from a publisher in Chicago, because there were not enough good books within 50 miles, and she had decided to do something about it. She set up a lending library in 2 shelves of the general store, and by autumn the shelves were in constant rotation, and people she had not expected to find reading were reading, and she found this deeply satisfying in a way that was difficult to explain but was entirely real. By the second winter, they had settled into a life that was theirs in every particular, built from scratch, on a mountain, from nothing but what they had brought to it and what they had built together. It was not a life that would have been recognizable to the version of Irene Yates who had stood in a Cincinnati office 2 years ago, reviewing shipping manifests, while Gerald Beaumont watched her from the doorway. It was better than that life in every dimension she could measure, and several she had not previously thought to measure. She found out she was expecting in March of their second year. In the particular way a woman of that era discovered such things. Gradually, and then certainly, the evidence accumulating over several weeks before she could no longer reasonably deny it. She told Arthur on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, and she watched him receive the information. He went very still, the way he went still when something mattered enormously. And then he set down his coffee cup very carefully, and he came around the table and knelt beside her chair so he was eye level with her, and he took her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he asked first, because that was who he was. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm well, actually. I feel very well." He held her hands and looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she saw in him the same thing she had seen in the early days, the care, the attention, the immense quiet steadiness, and underneath it now, rising through, something that was pure and uncomplicated joy. "A child," he said, as if getting used to the sound of it. "In September, I think," she said. He kissed her hands, both of them, and then he pressed his forehead against her hands and stayed like that for a moment, and she felt the warmth of him through her skin and down into her bones, and she thought that her father would have loved Arthur Lockhart. She thought he would have approved of every single choice she had made since she walked away from Gerald Beaumont in Cincinnati and stepped off a stagecoach into a November evening in Montana with a carpet bag and a leather satchel and no plan. The summer of the second year was the best summer Irene had known. She was healthy through the pregnancy, robust, Clara Hatch said, with the satisfied authority of a woman who had seen a great many pregnancies, and she continued her work through July, and Arthur was even more attentive than usual, which was saying something. He had fixed every uneven board in every floor of the cabin. He had added a proper railing to the porch steps. He had cataloged every potential hazard on the trail between the cabin and town, and removed or addressed each one with systematic thoroughness that she found equal parts endearing and amusing. "Arthur," she said one evening, when she found he had reorganized the kitchen shelves to put everything she used frequently at a height that did not require her to reach, "I am expecting a child not made of glass." "I know," he said. "I'm just being careful." "You're being wonderful," she said, because she could not maintain even the most affectionate complaint when the truth was that his care was something she received fully and without embarrassment, because she knew it came from love rather than from a belief that she was incapable. The baby came in the first week of September, on a day when the aspens in the valley were just beginning to turn gold, and Clara Hatch was there, and the doctor from town, a young man named Pierce who had come west from Ohio and was extremely earnest, and Arthur was outside the bedroom door the entire time in the way of men in 1881, which is to say trying very hard not to burst through it. Irene heard him pacing. She did not find childbirth easy, but she found it survivable, which was all she had asked for. And when it was done, Clara put the baby in her arms, a boy, red-faced and enormous-lunged, with a look of profound indignation at the world he had just entered. And Arthur was allowed in, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression of a man who has been surprised by the depth of something he had expected to feel but still underestimated. He reached out one large finger and the baby wrapped his fist around it with the instinctive grip of the very new, and Arthur looked at that small hand around his finger and then at Irene and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was not entirely steady. "He has your nose," Irene said. "Poor fellow," Arthur said, and she laughed, weakly and joyfully. They named him James Arthur Lockhart, James for her father, Arthur for his own, which was a coincidence of names that she felt was in some way a small, private satisfaction, as though two men who had never met were in agreement about something important. Young James proved to be an energetic and determined infant who had opinions about everything from the beginning and was not shy about expressing them. He also, to Arthur's enormous and slightly bashful delight, took an immediate and complete shine to his father, and by the time he was 6 months old, he would quiet from any level of distress the moment Arthur picked him up, which was a fact that Irene noted and did not resent in the slightest because it meant she got occasional rest, and because watching Arthur hold his son was one of the more regularly moving sights in her life. Arthur talked to James constantly about the mountain, the trap lines, the horses, the weather, the stars visible from the porch on clear winter nights. He carried the boy in a sling against his chest when he did the morning chores, and James looked out at the world from that height with the wide, interested eyes of someone who intends to explore all of it as soon as someone lets him down, and he figures out how his legs work. Coldwater Crossing had changed slightly in the 2 years Irene had been there. A second hotel had opened. A milliner had established a shop. A new family, the Orendorfs, had come up from Colorado and started a proper bakery that sent good smells down the street from early morning. The school where Miss Priscilla Ames taught had added a second room and now had 2 teachers, and Miss Ames, it turned out, was a perfectly pleasant person who had taken 3 books from Irene's lending library and returned them in perfect condition with a note of appreciation. A small medical office had opened next to the dentist, young Dr. Pierce, establishing himself with more commitment than the town had expected. The town was not a city and never would be, but it was growing into something, and Irene felt her place in it grow with it. Not the stray woman who had blown in on the last stage with a carpet bag and no plan, but a person with roots, with work, with a role in how the place was becoming itself. She hired a young woman in the spring of James's first year, a 17-year-old named Becky whose family had just come through hard times and who needed work. Irene trained her in the bookkeeping for Hamish's saloon and the livery, and within 6 months Becky had it fully in hand and Irene had transferred both accounts to her and moved on to 2 new clients, a cattle rancher east of town and a freighting company that had started running goods through the territory and needed someone to manage the correspondence. Her work was expanding in ways she had not anticipated, and she had begun, quietly, to think about what it might look like over the next decade. Arthur watched her build this with a pride that was entirely free of any competing instinct. He had no desire to diminish what she was making. He was, if anything, her most consistent advocate, the person who told the cattle rancher and the freighter that they would not find anyone more capable, the person who sat with her in the evenings when she was working through a difficult piece of correspondence or a complicated account, and offered perspective when asked and silence when that was more useful. They were, she thought often, very well matched. Not in the sense of sameness. They were not alike in temperament or background or particular skill, but in the sense that what each of them was fit together with what the other was in a way that was functional, and then, beyond function, genuinely good. James turned 2 in September, and by then he was walking with the determined, slightly aggressive forward lean of a mountain child, and he had his father's eyes and his mother's curiosity, and a vocabulary that was accumulating rapidly. And he called the horses by name and called Arthur Papa with a frequency and enthusiasm that made even Millie, who claimed to find children universally exhausting, visibly soften. The autumn of James's second year brought a letter from a man in Billings, the owner of a large freighting company, who had heard of Irene through the smaller company she already worked for. He wanted to hire her to restructure his entire accounting operation, which was described in terms that made very clear it was in significant disorder. The engagement would require her to be in Billings for 2 weeks to begin with and then provide remote oversight thereafter. She discussed it with Arthur at the kitchen table the evening the letter arrived. He read it twice, and then he looked at her. "You want to do it," he said. It was not a question. "It would be the largest engagement I've taken on," she said, "and it's good money." "It's also exactly the kind of work you're good at," he said. "What are you hesitating about?" 2 weeks in Billings," she said. "James and you and the autumn work." "James and I will be fine," he said. "Clara can come up if I need an extra pair of hands. He's 2 years old, not an infant. We'll manage." He paused. "Irene, you built something real here. Don't hesitate to use it because you feel guilty about being capable." She looked at him across the table, this man who had handed her a cup of coffee on a porch before she had introduced herself, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone loves you correctly. Not the possession of you, not the requirement that you remain smaller for their comfort, but the genuine desire for you to be the full size of yourself. "I'll write back tomorrow," she said. She went to Billings in October, on the stage that was not the last stage but the Thursday morning one, and Arthur was at the stage stop with her, and James was there too, in Arthur's arms, and the boy held his arms out to her when she came to say goodbye, and she held him for a long time and then kissed Arthur and climbed up. 2 weeks, she said. "Come home safe," he said. She spent 2 weeks in Billings dismantling an accounting system that had been built by a series of optimistic amateurs, and rebuilding it on foundations that would last. And she missed Arthur and James every day with a specificity that was its own kind of confirmation of everything she knew. She wrote letters every other day, long ones, and Arthur wrote back in his careful, exact hand brief notes that nevertheless contained more of him than most people's lengthy compositions. She came home on the Thursday stage, not the last one, but the one that arrived in the late afternoon, and Arthur was at the stage stop with James on his shoulders, and James spotted her coming down the step and said, "Mama," at a volume that turned heads halfway down the street, and she took the boy from Arthur's shoulders and held him against her while he informed her in detail, and at high speed about everything that had happened in her absence. And over the top of his moving head, she looked at Arthur and he looked at her. And everything that needed to be said between them was said in that look without a single word. He took her bag from her hand and walked beside her up the street toward the livery where the horses were, and she walked with her son on her hip and her husband beside her through the small main street of Coldwater Crossing, Montana Territory, in the last light of an October afternoon, and the mountains caught the setting sun and blazed red and gold around the whole valley, and she thought, I had no plan when I came here. I had $3 and a carpet bag and a bruised heart and not a single idea what was going to happen next. And then a mountain man had coffee ready before she asked, and everything happened from there. Their third year brought a mild spring and a productive summer, and the quiet deepening of everything they had built. James continued to be his own particular person, opinionated, daring, extremely interested in anything his father was doing. And by the time he was nearly 3, he had a very clear sense of himself and of his world, and his world was the cabin and the mountain and the town below and his parents and the horses, and it was everything he required. In the spring of their 4th year, Irene found herself expecting again. She told Arthur on a Sunday morning, same as before, same kitchen table, same coffee, and he went still in exactly the same way, and then he looked at her with the same joy, and she loved that he was consistent in this, that his feeling had not diminished with familiarity but was simply present, the same shape it had always been. "Another September, I think," she said. "September is a good month," he said. "September is when the aspens turn," she said. That's why it's a good month, he said. This time it was a girl born in the second week of September, as predicted, smaller than James had been, but with the same immediate and total presence. A child who looked at the world with eyes that were brown like Irene's and a calm that was entirely her own. They named her Irene Lockhart for no particular reason, except that it suited her immediately. Me for Arthur's mother, who had been a steady and practical woman by his account, and who had died the year before Arthur came west. James, at 3, received his sister with the complicated mixture of interest and territorial uncertainty that eldest children have managed since the beginning of time. But within a week, he had settled into a role of devoted, if occasionally overbearing, older brother, and Irene, from very early on, was entirely unintimidated by him. The years built on each other. Coldwater Crossing grew into a proper town, adding a post office of its own, a new school building, a doctor's office that was now shared by Pierce, and a second physician named Albrecht who had come up from Denver. The railroad talk that had been circulating through the territory for years moved closer to reality, and by the time James was 5 and Irene was 2, there was a railway spur confirmed for a town 20 miles south that would change the logistics of everything: freight, communication, travel, in ways that Irene was already calculating. She had by then built a small business that was entirely her own, 3 steady clients. One of them the Billings freighter who had never once been anything but professional and delighted with her work, a name in the territory's business correspondence network, and a small but real reputation. Arthur's guiding business had grown too, extending beyond the Philadelphia clients to include a partnership with a territorial outfitting company that sent 4 or 5 parties through the Beartooth Range each summer under his guidance. He had taken on a young man named Cole as an assistant, 20 years old, quiet and capable, and the operation was more than one man's work, which was how it had come to need 2. On the evening of their 5th anniversary, they sat on the porch of the cabin in the last light of a September evening, Irene asleep inside, and James determinedly not asleep, but quiet because he had been promised that if he was quiet his father would take him fishing in the morning. Arthur had brought out 2 cups of coffee, as he always did, and they sat side by side in the chairs he had made for the porch: wide, solid chairs with backs at the exact right angle, and the valley below was deep in shadow while the peaks above still caught the last of the sun. 5 years, she said. From that Tuesday in November when you came up the mountain and took coffee from a stranger, he said. You made it easy, she said. I wanted you to stay, he said. She looked at him in the fading light, the strong lines of his face, the way his hair still curled a little at the collar, the breadth of his shoulders against the evening sky, and she thought about the woman she had been, stepping off the stage in the cold November dusk with a carpet bag and a satchel and a heart full of loss and not a plan to her name. She thought about the specific luck of taking the right stagecoach to the right town, of asking the right storekeeper, of riding up the right mountain on a borrowed gray mare. She thought about coffee, ready before she asked for it. Arthur, she said. He turned to look at her. I'm very glad I ran away, she said. He smiled, that full, open smile that she had been collecting for 5 years and still felt like a gift each time. So am I, he said. Every single day. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had at that kitchen table in February of their first winter, careful and warm, and she held his back, and they sat together on the porch of their cabin on the side of Harrow Peak as the September light left the mountains one ridge at a time, and the stars came out over Montana one by one, and below them the small lights of Coldwater Crossing glittered in the dark valley like a handful of stars that had fallen and settled, and everything was exactly, completely, wholly as it should be. James got his fishing trip in the morning and caught 3 fish with enormous personal satisfaction, and Irene woke from her nap in the afternoon with her hair wild and her opinion of the state of affairs clear and immediate, and Arthur took her from her crib and held her against his chest and walked her around the kitchen talking to her about the mountains the way he had talked to James, the way he had been talking to his children, since there were children to talk to. And Irene stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched him with their daughter, and felt the particular and renewable joy of knowing where you are and choosing it, every morning, with full knowledge of what you chose. She had arrived on the last stage with no plan, and the mountain man had coffee ready before she asked, and what had grown from that single unremarkable act of hospitality on a cold November porch, 2 lives joined, 2 children rooted in the mountain, a business built from capability and trust, a home that was wholly and specifically theirs, was the thing she would have chosen if she had known in advance what she was choosing. But she had not known. She had simply arrived. And that, she thought, watching Arthur settle a leaner against his shoulder, while James chased something around the paddock with the aggressive optimism of a 5-year-old, that was perhaps the best kind of arriving. The kind you do not plan. The kind that plans you instead, gently and completely, from a cup of coffee forward into everything. The mountains stood around the cabin the way they always had and always would, enormous and patient and permanent. And the coffee was ready in the morning, and the fire was lit, and the children were theirs, and the life was theirs, and it was good. It was, by any measure she knew how to use, very good.